Hello, I'm Mary Campbell, Events Manager here at the Boston Globe. Welcome to today's event, What You Need to Know About Forever Chemicals. Before we get started, I would like to welcome some opening remarks from Ben Cody, representing today's sponsor, Logistec.
Thank you, Mary. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this event. My name is Ben Cote. I'm president of Senexen Water, a water technologies corporation headquartered in Massachusetts and installers of the ultra-proven solutions. We are honored to sponsor today's event. Open discussions like we will witness today bring more awareness on the growing environmental problem that needs to be addressed safely and permanently. And this is why we chose to sponsor today's event. I now look forward to hearing from our panel of experts on what you need to know about forever chemicals and how we need to deal with the problem. I'll share more with you on Senexen at the end of this discussion. Back to you, Mary.
Thanks, Ben. Now I'd like to hand it over to the Globe's environmental reporter, David Abel, to get us started. David?
Hi, thank you so much, Mary, and everyone at the Globe for organizing this. My name is David Abel. I've been the Globe's environment reporter for a decade, but I have only had a hazy idea about what PFAS was until roughly 2 years ago, when I wrote what was kind of a foreboding front page story for the paper about how the chemicals were found in the water supply of 7 communities in Massachusetts. In the process of writing that and reporting that story, I learned how PFAS are called forever chemicals because they never fully break down in the environment. I also learned that they're harmful to human health and that they've been linked to cancer, pregnancy complications, compromised immune systems, and a range of diseases. What was most eye-opening to me as I began to learn about PFAS was how prevalent they are, that there are thousands of them, and that until recently, there have been little to no regulation of them. The toxic chemicals are now widely known to be in non-stick pans, furniture, food packaging, and water repellent materials such as rain jackets and umbrellas, among many other consumer products. As I began reporting on the chemicals in more depth, I learned they were found in high concentrations in other lesser known and possibly more concerning places, such as in bottled water that was being sold at Whole Foods, Stop and Shop, and other supermarkets, state-produced fertilizer that was being sold to farms and landscapers in Massachusetts, new forms of artificial turf that many towns are now using in their parks and at their schools, even in the heavy turnout gear worn by firefighters who have disproportionately high cancer rates. And they were also found in pesticides that we use to spray to try to prevent mosquito-borne viruses like Eastern equine encephalitis. And perhaps most concerning is that they've been increasingly found in our public drinking water. According to the latest test results received by the State Department of Environmental Protection, 52 large public water sources in Massachusetts, those that serve more than 10,000 people, have found elevated levels of PFAS in their drinking water as defined by the state. Those results stem from state regulations that took effect last fall that required public water sources this year to start testing for just 6 of the more well-known chemicals. There are believed to be more than 9,000 of them. The state, which now has some of the nation's most stringent rules on PFAS, requires public water sources to ensure that those 6 chemicals cumulatively amount to concentrations lower than 20 parts per trillion, which is the equivalent to about 20 grains of sand in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Despite those regulations, and all that we've learned about PFAS in recent years, there are still no federal regulations that limit their use. Okay, with all that said, I'm really pleased to be joined today by a stellar panel who will help us understand what these chemicals are, their risks, and how we can protect ourselves. Elsie Sunderland is the Gordon McKay Professor of Environmental Chemistry at Harvard University and is one of the nation's leading experts on PFAS. Martin Suberg, the commissioner of the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, is responsible for enforcing the state's new PFAS rules. And Moreo Fernandez Imora, Associate State Director of the advocacy group Clean Water Action, has been in the trenches dealing with the environmental impacts of PFAS and other toxic substances such as lead. Welcome, everybody. We'll start off with me asking each of you a number of questions, and then we'll open it up a bit later to audience questions. But before we start, I just want to make it clear that these are solely my questions, and it was me alone that selected the panel. There was no influence whatsoever from the event sponsor. Okay. Professor Sunderland, we'll start with you. I'd really appreciate it if you could start by telling us how you came to study PFAS, when you became concerned about the chemicals, and how our collective understanding of them has changed in recent years.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me on the panel today, David. I actually started studying these compounds, looking at some epidemiological data produced by my colleague Philippe Grandjean at the School of Public Health, and he was looking at the immune response associated with exposure to these compounds in a birth cohort in the Faroe Islands. And he showed that for each doubling of PFAS, one of the most prevalently found PFAS compounds in the environment, there was a 50% decline in antibody production. And this is one of the most potent immunotoxic responses that we've ever seen. So this is really how I started working on them. And I think it's a very concerning issue. And I've forgotten the second half of your question, so you'll have to remind me. I should note it down.
Maybe you could just tell us a little bit about how our collective understanding and how what your research has shed light on in terms of how we've come to understand that they're dangerous.
Yeah, so I think when we started looking at them, we were looking at compounds like PFAS, which one of the most prevalently produced ones. There was a lot of work looking at PFAS and PFOA, and what we've come to understand. You already very eloquently introduced us to these ideas, in that there are many thousands of chemical structures that are emerging and a greater and greater diversity of known sources. And there are many, many health effects that we didn't understand when we first started looking at them. And so I guess my research is predominantly focused on understanding the diverse exposure pathways to PFAS chemicals. We actually still have very rudimentary understanding of exposure pathways in the human population outside of contaminated sites. So near PFAS contaminated sites, we understand it's drinking water, but beyond that, you highlighted very nicely, David, the diversity of potential exposure sources, and we don't understand what's most important for different types of the groups in the general population. So this is really what we're trying to better quantify, so that we can develop effective interventions and mitigation measures.
I've heard some say that we're overhyping the risks of PFAS, and that they require extensive exposure over many years and in significant quantities for the health risks to emerge. A reader recently wrote to me after a story we published in Monday's paper, who said PFAS at the parts per trillion level is probably comparable to the cancer risk from the radiation that leaks from the microwave ovens that we use multiple times every day. I'd appreciate if you could respond to those concerns that we're overhyping this, or that the risks are minimal because they require tremendous amounts of exposure.
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, and I think risk perception is what we want to contemplate here. And I think when you think about perceived risks, we often perceive things that we can't control ourselves. So things where we have very high levels of background exposures to something that we can't change. Gina McCarthy talks about it as, if we take all the actions to lead a healthy lifestyle, if we eat a healthy diet and exercise regularly and do all those things, then we should have the right to live a healthy life. And if you have an uncontrolled, ubiquitous chemical exposure in the population, that does pose risks to, you highlighted some of them at fairly low levels, and we can detect these compounds in 98% of the US population. I guess I would disagree with your reader on that front. So, how you manage your own risks is a very personal choice. But I think the fact that there are ubiquitous background exposures to these chemicals that have been associated with a very broad suite of adverse health outcomes is very concerning. And that's why we really want to reduce those exposures and mitigate those risks.
We'll come to the question of how you actually mitigate your exposure. And I'm going to ask you about that in a little bit. But can you first talk about how some of your studies have shown that PFAS in quantities as minute as 1 part per trillion can pose health risks? And is it fair to compare PFAS to lead, in which most public health officials now say that there's no safe amount to ingest?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a wonderful question, David. There's sort of a philosophical question when you look at any kind of chemical exposure, which is what is safe. And we develop, so EPA has developed a provisional lifetime health advisory for drinking water, which is not legally enforceable, but they used a certain method to calculate a level of 70 nanograms per liter, which is above the level that Massachusetts has established using typical risk assessment procedures. And what my colleague Philippe Grandjean, who I mentioned a moment ago, did using data on from the Faroe Islands on children's immunotoxicity as an outcome, which is a much more sensitive response. So whenever we look at developing risk guidelines, we often want to protect the most sensitive populations, and children are one of these populations. And in doing that calculation, so using immunotoxicity as the endpoint of concern in children, and using the same methods that EPA used to calculate its drinking water provisional lifetime health advisory, you would end up with a 1 nanogram per liter drinking water advisory instead of 70. And so that's really the question. I think what we're seeing now across the country as different states step in, like Massachusetts has stepped up and developed a somewhat more stringent standard that's also legally enforceable. We see levels, ranging from that whole spectrum. Many of the states are falling more in that 10 to 20 nanogram per liter range for their advisories. And I guess this is very common with these chemicals in that, the more we know, often we're able to detect health effects at more and more sensitive levels, and how protective we want to be, how much we want to protect that especially sensitive population, because it does require investment of societal resources, is where we put that risk level or that safety threshold. So that's a long-winded response, but I hope it conveys the important points.
Well, in short, I mean, do you think that the state standards and the federal standards are insufficiently stringent, given what your research has shown?
I think that my perspective would be that I think at a level of 70, it's looking a little bit high compared to some of the more recent data. So I think that the states are doing a better job of that. I think another concern is just how many chemicals we're considering in that safety standard. And so, as you mentioned, that some of them are considered just 2 PFAS. Massachusetts is considering 6, which again, credit to the state because they're ahead of the game in terms of the federal regulations. But we have, 9,000 potential structures. Most of the toxicity data doesn't exist yet for the majority of those compounds. So again, it's, regulations are a question of safety, but also feasibility. So where should that right level be is not you asked an academic, so
Okay,
it's
all
not my
right.
place to answer, but
I
but I think
imagine
they're
Maria will
mentioned
give
that-
me
yeah,
a little
yeah.
different response, but I want to get to the commissioner. But before I do, I just want to ask you: can you talk about some steps you take to protect yourself from PFAS? Do you use non-stick pans? Did you get rid of any carpeting in your house with PFAS? Do you filter your water? And more importantly, what do you recommend for viewers?
Yes, all of the above, and thank you for creating that nice checklist. So I think that the question that if you're concerned about PFAS exposure, the thing you can do is ask yourself, are PFAS essential in these various products where they're present? And if they're not essential, then often there are options that don't contain PFAS. There's increasing labeling and awareness of PFAS present in products like, outdoor gear, on furniture coatings, in carpets and things like that. So you as a consumer can make choices that reduce your overall exposure to PFAS. Our studies—
What are some of those labels?
They often say, PFAS, PFOA-free, PFOS-free. To be honest, I'm a little bit suspect of some of those labels because I wonder if they've just added a different PFAS. So working with the sustainability office at Harvard, we've actually been testing a variety of those products. And the sustainability office at Harvard has been doing great work ensuring that many products are free from some of these chemicals and increasing transparency in consumer products. So I think that's something that as consumers, we can really look to and work on to protect ourselves. So
Okay.
thanks for the question, David.
Great, thank you. Commissioner Stuberg, when did you first become aware of PFAS as a public health concern? And how has your understanding of the dangers evolved over the years? And can you discuss what role DEP plays in addressing PFAS?
Well, thank you, David, for organizing this discussion on what we have all acknowledged is a very timely topic. And I really appreciate being here with the panelists. I'd say probably the most immediate milestone, our agency and EPA look at contaminants that are both regulated and unregulated to figure out what a course of action should be going forward. And so these unregulated contaminants are a source of concern. I would say 2016 was an important year because that was the year that the US EPA changed its health advisory. As Professor Sunderland noted, there is not an enforceable federal drinking water standard there, but this health advisory was revised at the end of the Obama administration to lower it from a higher number to the 70 parts per trillion number that we've heard about. We as an agency use those health advisory numbers in doing our own work. That number drives federal cleanups. It drives work we do with water systems. And so we began using that 70 part per trillion number and taking a close look at it after it was published in late 2016, which led us to start applying it as a guideline for our drinking water systems throughout 2017, 2018. I'll say that for us, we ended up, given the increasing amount of information that came out, federal studies, European studies that came out in 2019, 2020, we actually did our own revised standard or our own revised guideline based on this new information, or what we understood of toxicity, chemical structures, a number of factors, and revised it to a guideline of the 20 parts per trillion that you and the professor alluded to. That was the basis for us adopting cleanup standards for soil and water. It was also the basis for us moving forward with the drinking water standard you alluded to, which was adopted in October of 2020. So the drinking water standard requires testing, and if systems have exceedances, working with us to identify short and long-term solutions. So we have two sets of regulations: the drinking water standard, we have the cleanup standards. We are also working, and you alluded to some of this in your opening, We're also looking at effluents. Yeah, you wrote an article about effluents from wastewater treatment plants. We're doing more monitoring and working with EPA on that. You talked about residuals, soil application, fertilizers, if you will. We have a work group going on addressing those issues. You've talked about pesticides. We work with our colleague agency, the Department of Agricultural Resources. It started with the spray application of one pesticide, which was brought to our attention by the group PEER in the summer of 2020. We've gone on to not only do work with that, it ended up becoming a national issue for US EPA, but also here in Massachusetts, testing other pesticides that are used for mosquito control. So I just say we're in a number of areas. We started with drinking water because that's obviously an important exposure point. That's an area where, ingestion and exposure is an area that we work on regularly and we can address. And so it started with drinking water, but it's fair to say that the number of areas we're working in is growing.
Can you tell us how you guys at the state arrived at your decision to set the standard in Massachusetts at 20 parts per trillion for just 6 of the chemicals, when there are many other concerning chemicals out there? And the research that Professor Sunderland was talking about suggests perhaps, and maybe Maria will give us a more emphatic response, that the concentrations probably should be at a lower level.
Sure. It started that 2016 health advisory that EPA, that I talked about. It started with 2 of the compounds, the ones called PFAS and PFOA. And again, that's still an area of major attention. Some of our fellow states are regulating those 2 compounds. EPA, I believe, is talking about developing a drinking water standard related to those 2 compounds. What we did, again, our Office of Research and Standards was reviewing the information from EPA, from other federal health agencies, academia, European sources, to not only look at those 2 compounds, but to look at other compounds that have similar chemical structures. And so that's how we came up with the list of 6. And again, applying the more recent data and the risk factors, we adopted the 20 versus the 70 part per trillion number. I will also acknowledge that this is an area of growing concern, an ongoing concern. This drinking water rule, unlike others, actually has a mandatory review time built in. At a minimum of every 3 years, where we go back and review the data. We may not wait 3 years, but at a minimum of every 3 years, we're looking at the data to make sure we know the most up-to-date information and are regulated accordingly. So we are relying on, again, what we know. This class of contaminants, we know a lot about the toxicity. As the professor indicated, at this point, there are others that we may be learning about, but right now we know about this level of toxicity, and we felt it appropriate to regulate the 6 compounds, summing them up to the parts of 20 parts per trillion.
You may have already just answered it, but can you respond directly to folks who criticize the state's response as insufficient and want to have stricter standards?
Well, I think most people would be happy that, first of all, or reassured, first of all, that we're testing and we're looking. And we're testing to look down to the lowest levels we can detect. We're getting a tremendous amount of information. Over the course of this year, we will know a lot more about the presence of PFAS. Secondly, this standard, again, we're in company with our fellow states. The information is driving us, certainly as the professor indicated, below 70 to 20 parts per trillion. The systems we're working with are doing things to make sure that they are eliminating these sources. And in many cases, by eliminating the problematic sources, they're really doing a lot to improve water quality. So we believe this is an important step. It's based on the science and the technical information we have. And again, we are going to continue to work with those systems to make sure that we're addressing the issues. And as we go forward, we're going to continue to reevaluate the science.
And on the flip side, I'd appreciate if you could respond to those who say the state is overreacting, like the reader that I quoted a few minutes ago, and that requiring towns to reduce their PFAS in water imposes a huge economic burden on them, which some of the critics suggest from the other side that is unnecessary, especially when some towns are looking at spending as much as $10 million to build new filtration systems.
Right. Well, certainly we understand the cost, and we're trying to work with communities, whether it's through our state revolving fund, the Clean Water Trust, that provides zero interest loans for these projects. We, as a result of the administration working with the legislature, we provided resources for free sampling for one round of sampling. We provided resources for designing, grants to design systems, a grant program to help communities deal with the short term while they're figuring out the long term thing. So we're very mindful of the fact that we all need to work together on this. But in terms of the overregulation, I think the critique would be where the professor is, and I'd say, our Office of Research and Standards, reviewed the same data, and there are impacts. And again, part of this is there's a suite of impacts. Again, we're very concerned about making sure that we are limiting exposures to women of childbearing years and infants. The data we have suggests that this is an appropriate measure and one that it is time to take.
Okay, thank you. Last week, Vermont became the first state to ban PFAS in a range of products, including ski wax, carpets, aftermarket treatments to carpets, and more. It also joined several other states in prohibiting the chemicals in food packaging. Should Massachusetts be doing that as well? And would that require a vote by the legislature, or is that something the DEP could regulate on its own? I believe there are several bills that are working their way through the legislature on this, and I'd appreciate if you might tell us where the administration stands on those.
Sure. And, we, as I noted, we started with the drinking water because that was an important source of exposure, but it's not surprising that, people are looking to eliminate the sources. And we're taking a close look at what Vermont has done. One real important area where we're going to be talking about this is earlier this year, there was legislation passed creating an interagency PFAS task force. It's chaired, I believe, by Representative Hogan and Senator Sear. They're both legislators from communities that early on had to address PFAS. We're part of that discussion, as are a number of our colleagues in environment and health agencies. I think that's an important venue for us to have the discussion, even as we review these other approaches. And so we're very much looking forward to participating in those discussions.
Okay. Anything though specifically you can say about where the state stands on these legislative proposals and whether the DEP can, regulate these food packaging on its own, or is that require a law?
I think I'm always loath, maybe as an attorney, to give an answer about whether we have the authority of the legislative. We need the legislative support. I really do think that this task force is going to be an important opportunity. We do have people looking at our authorities. We understand our authorities in when it comes to solid waste, drinking water, wastewater, and we are going to continue to use existing authorities. But this is a really important opportunity to work with the legislature.
Okay, and last question, and then thank you for your patience, Mario. We're going to come to you. What would you like to see, Commissioner, from the federal government in terms of action or rules on PFAS? And do you think PFAS should be regulated as a class rather than as individual chemicals?
Well, we were encouraged to see the new EPA administrator on behalf of the administration did indicate that dealing with PFAS was going to be a priority. I believe there were a number of actions, not the least of which was developing a drinking water standard for, I think, I'm not entirely sure that they've resolved the class versus the individual. I know they're taking a close look at the two compounds. it is really helpful to have the federal government working on this area. Again, I believe as you know, this new administration is pursuing this issue, I think they're going to look at the same data that we're looking at, and I think we're all going to benefit from that. I know there are efforts to not only look at drinking water. I know they're starting to look at wastewater. I know there's federal legislation that looks at products. So it seems like EPA is looking to be more active in PFAS this year. I think the acting regional administrator is the co-chair of a PFAS task force that will be looking at a number of issues. And so I'm hoping that this kind of collaboration, this kind of information sharing will be helpful. But I think it's very positive that they're moving forward on developing an MCL. I think just the thinking.
MCL is maximum.
My apologies. I swore I wouldn't use an acronym and I did. Yeah, that's the drinking water standard. The
maximum concentration amounts.
Right, maximum contamination limit. Right. So
Okay.
concentration limit. So yeah, it's going to be very positive for them. You know, if you know, as they make progress on this.
Okay, thank you, Mario. Again, thanks for your patience. Okay, tell us, if you would, how you first became aware of PFAS and how your work relates to the chemicals and what impacts you're seeing in the communities that you're working in.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So I kind of had a baptism by fire moment with PFAS, where I was hired right around the time that Massachusetts DEP announced that it was pursuing a maximum contaminant level as a result of a petition submitted by Conservation Law Foundation and Community Action Works, previously known as Toxics Action Center. And so at that point, I started learning as much as I could about PFAS chemicals, really from the context of water and what a really socially responsible maximum contaminant level would look like in Massachusetts. And through that work, we were also, of course, talking to impacted communities that already knew that they had elevated sample results of PFAS in their drinking water. And really what I learned from that was that impacted communities are not satisfied with only testing for 6 PFAS chemicals. I think when you tell people that there are thousands of these chemicals already in the environment, and we have, as Professor Sunderland said, unfortunately not enough research to know exactly how those thousands of chemicals interact in the environment. We do know that they stick around basically forever. We know that they're really persistent in the body. And we know that even though right now there has been a lot of attention, as there should be, towards PFAS, there are a lot of chemicals that we don't know exactly what those health effects look like. And even for newer chemicals, we do know, for instance, this myth of short chain versus long chain, where short chain chemicals are always better, isn't correct. You have chemicals like PFAS, which actually stay in the body longer than some long chain chemicals. So based off of all of that, and working with impacted communities as we were working to submit comments for the MCL, what I really learned is that people are not satisfied with this lack of information. People want it out of their water as soon as possible, and want to understand both what the risks are for the thousands of PFAS chemicals, not just the 6 that we're currently regulating. And they also want to understand what potential health impacts they might have to worry about in their lifetime. And I do want to say, I think that we need more in the ways of biomonitoring to understand how people currently being exposed to these chemicals are being affected. And there needs to be more research in that area as well.
Can you say specifically what you or your organization, Clean Water Action, wants the state to be doing that it's maybe not doing?
Yeah, and I also want to say, I mean, our role is always better, more, faster. And, you know, that really does come as a result of working directly with communities who want this problem figured out as quickly as possible, and want and deserve as much information as possible. So I will say there are a lot of good parts of the rule. I applaud DEP for their efforts. And I think that it could have gone further, even recognizing the current limitations around studies. So one thing right off of the bat, the EPA testing method 533 can quantify and test for 25 different PFAS chemicals. That's 14 of the 18 PFAS in method 537.1, plus an additional 11 short chain chemicals. And I hope I've already, hit the point that short chain chemicals don't necessarily mean not dangerous. And so we really wanted to see all PFAS that are able to be tested for reflected in that final rule. And commercial laboratories actually are able to test for more, I think up to 40 different kinds of PFAS. So we really did want to see all of the PFAS that currently could be tested for to be represented in that MCL.
I'm just going to ask the scientists to step in here because this is something that's very, this subject can easily get really dense. So Professor Sunderland, can you just tell us briefly what the difference is between long chain and short chain PFAS chemicals, and why is that sufficient? And we do focus often on PFOS and PFAS and the more common older stuff that's been around, but this stuff is still being manufactured. Maybe you can just tell us how it's evolved, and Maria, then I'm going to come back to you.
Yeah, sure. So I think the PFAS chemicals themselves are carbon, so they're carbon chain compounds. It's what we call an aliphatic chain. So it's a linear molecule. That's why it's such a good surfactant. And then it has a fluorine, instead of hydrogen, it has a lot of fluorine on it. And the number of carbons is what we call the chain length. And so initially, we had what was called C8 chemistry, as in there were 8 carbons. So those were the most prevalently produced carbons. And this idea of short chain, long chain is really something that's been invented by industry. That's not a real chemical nomenclature or distinguishing factor. It's just sort of a concept that was put forward. The longer chain compounds, so more than 7 perfluorinated, so fully fluorinated carbons, have certain properties in terms of how longer half-life in the human body, tendency to bioaccumulate in food webs more. And so that's where some of those ideas come from. But I guess I would add to this, so there are some great points made about, we only have a certain number of compounds that we can detect using EPA methods. And this, as you point out, David, it does get very dense, but it's critically important for understanding this issue, which is our ability to detect these compounds depends on having chemical standards that we can use with this EPA method. And those are only available for a few. In fact, industry has many more standards than we have available even in academic labs. So in my lab, for example, we measure around 50 different what we call targeted compounds, but there are a ton of compounds. This is what some of our research on Cape Cod has been showing recently. There are a much greater fraction of what we call organofluorine compounds. And they aren't necessarily these common ones that we've been talking about in the drinking water or otherwise, but some of those organofluorine compounds degrade into the ones that we already know have negative health impacts over time. So we talk about PFAS as forever chemicals. Well, it turns out that in fact, there are large quantities of precursors to forever chemicals also released by industry and many sources that add to that burden that we're simply missing. So I just wanted to highlight that because it does get technical, but it's really important. Bottom line, we're probably underestimating exposure.
Oh, that's great news. And just to keep it very simple for a lay audience, is it reasonable to understand that the newer PFAS that's being manufactured is potentially more dangerous than the older PFAS for the reasons that you explained, or is it the opposite?
Actually, I think it's mixed. So there's some new, there's chemical screening data, there are different assays that you can use, and there's animal data. Certainly the narrative that's been put forward by industry is that long chain PFAS we learned were unsafe. So we switched to short chain PFAS, and those are safe. And that we know is untrue. And in fact, it's not just long chain and short chain compounds. There's a tremendous diversity of chemical structures now out there, emerging PFAS. and it's very mixed. So some listeners may have heard of Gen X. So there's now quite a bit of data showing, very concerning health information associated with exposure to Gen X compounds. So it's, it's certainly, we're not in the clear when we say we're shifting the chemistry of these compounds toward different structures.
And the changing nature of the chemical profiles and how they get introduced into the world in terms of consumer products is making it very difficult to regulate. And I just wanted to shift back to Moreo and ask you, given these complexities, given that we're still learning a lot about these chemicals and the chemicals that we don't even know about, what do you want to see from Congress? What do you think the federal government should be doing? Do you think the Biden administration and the new EPA administrator are taking this issue sufficiently seriously? And what do you expect to see within the next 4 years? It's a lot of questions.
That is a lot of questions. And do you mind if I wrap up a few more comments about the MCL in Massachusetts?
Please, yeah, and then go on to the federal question.
Yeah, and so I'll try to keep it brief. I think that going off of what Professor Sunderland said, and thank you for providing that context, ultimately, we believe really strongly that PFAS need to be regulated as a class. We kind of refer to it as this whack-a-mole strategy where you have thousands of chemicals, and if you go to regulate one by one, we're already in this place of permanently playing catch up behind industry and what they know and what they've put into our environment. It doesn't make sense to keep doing that. We really do need to work towards regulating it as a class. I understand that'll take time from a technical standpoint, but that needs to be the goal and that needs to be the orientation that we're moving towards. And then one last thing, the 20 parts per trillion for the sum total of 6 is one of the strongest in the country, but we actually really hoped to see a 1 part per trillion standard. Particularly Conservation Law Foundation in their comments cited a study where they observed children who were exposed to PFAS and PFOA specifically over the years, where it was discovered that there was a strong dose reaction where there was less reaction to vaccines for tetanus, which raises the question about how immunotoxicity is being affected by PFAS and how effective vaccines are going to be in the future due to PFAS exposure. I probably don't need to make the obvious link to COVID to say why I'm particularly worried about that. And the researchers of that study, based off of that information, said, we really want a 1 part per trillion standard. And so that's what we advocated for in the rule as well. I am really glad that there's an automatic 3-year review. I think that that's going to make a huge difference. I hope that we keep learning more and that we continue to regulate more chemicals until we get to a class-based approach. So just wanted to make those 2 points. In terms of federal regulation, I do think the Biden administration seems serious. They took a lot of action the first 100 days. Looking forward to the start of an EPA regulation, at least for PFAS and PFOA. I think that in addition to some of the federal regulations that I do hope we see come out, I still want to emphasize that I think that there's a lot of work that states can be doing. States can often move faster, have stricter standards than what we see on the federal level. So we will definitely be watchdogs on the federal level, especially around making sure that we're using the Clean Water Act correctly and really monitoring discharges of PFAS into our water. Also making sure that new chemicals of PFAS ideally stop being introduced into the market, because ultimately, and I really want to emphasize this point, we need to clean up the water, we need to be testing, but we need to be eliminating PFAS as a source so that it stops getting into the environment in the first place. It's extremely hard to treat out, it's extremely expensive for public water systems, and really the socially responsible thing to do, in my opinion, would be to stop all currently avoidable uses of PFAS by getting it out of products like as soon as possible, and really work to find safer alternatives in the future.
I'm going to open this question up to everybody. The most recent story I had about this issue was in the paper on Monday, in which we looked at the reports of testing from all the different towns that are now required, and not just towns, but public water sources, large public water sources, that because of the state's new laws are required to submit their test results to the state. And so far, 52, as I mentioned at the top, and that number is probably changing. I actually just heard a report today that Sharon just tested for and found elevated levels of PFAS. So that would make at least 53, I think. The question I have is, as of Monday, and I know this has changed, and Commissioner Suberg could probably talk about this, but based on the results, it was 20% of those that had actually submitted results, but that was a relatively small sample. There's more now, so that percentage has actually declined. But, and I'll start with you, Moreo. Just how concerned should we be about this, about these numbers?
Yeah, and I want to leave the science to the scientists on this, but bottom line, what I have taken from the scientific community and also the feedback that I get from impacted community members is that any amount of PFAS in drinking water is concerning. Any amount of PFAS in the body will stay there for a long time. We know that there are documented health effects, and we expect that there will be more documented health effects the more we continuously study these thousands of chemicals. And so any amount of PFAS in the drinking water is concerning because, like I said, in my world, we would have a 1 part per trillion standard. So an elevated beyond 20 parts per trillion to me is very concerning. And I'm also not surprised. So I'm sad to learn of how many communities are already dealing with this issue. And I think the one positive silver lining of this is that as more and more communities test for elevated PFAS levels, I hope that we start seeing resources on the state level to match. And I also really hope that we pursue litigation against companies that are actually the polluters, so that water systems aren't stuck with the cost of cleanup.
I would like to talk about the potential for litigation in a little bit if we have the time. But Professor Sunderland, how do you respond to that question? And then Commissioner, I'm going to come to you just so you can respond to that question, but also some of the things that Moreo suggested we should be doing.
Yeah, I think Moreo covered it nicely. It is concerning, obviously, to have a class of compounds that's so prevalently present in our drinking water supply. I think in your last story, David, you highlighted a statistic from a recent paper from scientists at the Environmental Working Group looking at, estimates on a national scale of how many people are exposed above different levels. And I think the thing to remember is these threshold levels don't necessarily clarify safe or unsafe. It's something that's established using a set of risk calculations which are changeable. So, we think the right level is somewhere between 1 and maybe 20, but there are a lot of other chemicals to think about. There's somewhere between 10 and 80 million US individuals who have drinking water, estimated to have drinking water above 10 nanograms per liter, for example. So it's an incredibly prevalent problem, and that's quite concerning. I think Mario touched on the issues nicely in that, we want to work to improve the situation and mitigate those exposure risks. I would also say, though, for the general population, it's not just drinking water. So we know about drinking water. We have the best handle on drinking water exposure, but we've touched on already in this discussion a number of other exposure pathways. So food, other types of food and consumer products. And we also need to get a handle on those exposures because similarly, those are contributing to the body burdens of PFAS measured in US individuals.
Thank you. Commissioner Suberg, how do you see these numbers, this what seems like a significant amount, 53 or so communities, and I'm sure that number, or not just communities, but large public water sources, is that concerning to you? What does it say to you about the about the risks and where this is all coming from, that it could be in such a diverse number of places that we're seeing this high level of these chemicals? And how do you respond to some of the things that Moreo said about 1 part per trillion being the standard that we should really be setting?
Well, I'll start first and foremost by saying, again, it's important to know. Sampling it and being aware is the first step to addressing an issue. And while we have communities, and we are dealing with these communities, for some communities, you know, the fixes are easier. For some, they're more challenging given the way each individual community is set up. We're working with each one to make sure that they have a short-term and a long-term plan for addressing it. We've had some good news. I mean, we have some of our larger systems. We started by testing the very large, now going to the systems that you're talking about between 10 and 50,000 customers served. You know, we have, you know, literally over 1,000 systems that we're going to be testing in this effort. And again, I think, you know, given what we knew about it, given what we knew about these chemicals, we knew that we would find some. And the best thing we can do is start working with those communities as we have. And each of those communities have stepped up to design these solutions. And it's going to be important that we continue to work together. Both, you know, the funding mechanisms I talked about, the ongoing public awareness, public education. I'll put a little plug in here for our DEP website, where we try to put all this information up in real time. And to Moreo's point, he was making a lot of really important points. You know, we are going to have better methodologies. The 533 technique he talked about came in after our rule went final. It's a very important discussion. In terms of keeping track, we're regulating a certain class, but we sample for more. We require the systems to report on the suite of chemicals that are that they're testing for right now, so that we can help build this knowledge base. And as Moreo talked about, when we're engaged in our review, that we can use all of this information. So I view this, you know, as an essential part of the program. This is what these drinking water standards do. They raise, they let us know what's going on and give us the opportunity to work both with the individual communities and more generally to make sure that we have effective rules.
Thanks. I just want to bring in a reader question or a listener question or a viewer question, however you define it. This is probably a question for Professor Sunderland. How do you compare the risks from ingesting PFAS through drinking water as compared to maybe an inhalation from it being in dust particles, or from essentially the question is, how do you compare the differences between drinking PFAS and the dangers in carpeting and in our clothing and in our furniture and so forth?
Yeah, that's a great question, David. I think that the idea is you assess the contribution to your internal body burden. So there are various ways you do that, but essentially if you ingest something, then a certain fraction is taken up by your body and it stays there for a certain time. With surprising, you can ingest dust as well. And you can, I guess so there's exposure sources and then there are exposure pathways. So the exposure pathways are, inhalation is one of them, but we don't think inhalation is really a substantial exposure pathway for PFAS. The one pathway that I think does need more investigation is dermal uptake. So PFAS are present in a lot of cosmetic products and things like this at very high concentrations. So the ability to sort of absorb those external doses, and that can to some extent apply to your furniture as well. So there's ingestion, and we know how to associate that with an internal body burden, which is then associated with a health outcome. For dermal uptake, we don't know that as clearly at this time. So that's an area where we need more information.
And just to sort of make it pretty simple for folks. Are there any specific products that you recommend folks get rid of or stop using?
I have a postdoctoral fellow in my group who did a study in Sweden, and she looked at a lot of very common name brand cosmetics, so skin creams and different types of cosmetic products. And I haven't seen such a parallel study in the United States, so I can't. It's actually also against my ethics to sort of name brands as well. But I'd be happy to share that publication with any of the listeners who are interested in this area. And you can actually typically see, I don't know if this is, again, a little bit too chemistry focused, but you can read it on the ingredient label if it included a fluorinated compound in many cases. So if it includes that active ingredient, you can highlight it. And there are ways of anticipating that it's likely to have high concentrations of PFAS.
Okay. Do any of you have questions for each other that you would care to ask?
If I may ask the commissioner, what do you view as we've had a bit of a discussion around regulating PFAS as a class. Could you offer a little bit more in terms of your perspectives on what some of the barriers to doing that might be? I agree with Mario that regulating these compounds as a class, really, given what we know about them, is probably the most effective approach because of this whack-a-mole problem, because we're always behind the game. And we have this body of evidence now that suggests we've got diverse chemicals, diverse health effects, but nothing looks particularly good. So in terms of moving forward for the state of Massachusetts, if the state was interested in doing that, what would the steps be? And is that something that you think has a future here?
It is certainly an ongoing and active discussion, and we're very mindful, as both you and Mario noted, the petition that initiated a lot of our work was looking for treatment as a class. And I suspect that's an issue. I've heard that's an issue at the federal level as well, as they consider the federal drinking water standard, which would be applicable to all. What we did was we used the information we had based on where we were. And again, we acknowledge that as we move forward, more information is coming. I've noted how fast a lot of the information on PFAS has come, probably more so than any other contaminant that I've personally dealt with. And we expect that to continue. What we relied on at the time was a subclass. Again, what we knew about the two chemicals that were the subject of the federal guideline, and then we looked at other compounds where we knew enough about it, about toxicology, about chemical structure, other issues. We have a very active Office of Research and Standards. We're going to continue to engage, but like other states, we think we're in the area where, not only based on what we know about contaminants today, we are also having to deal with how, the limits of testing. A number of factors go into that. And that's why we ended up where we ended up in 2020, but it will be an ongoing discussion. And part of what we do when we're at DEP, we have not only a terrific Office of Research and Standards, but we try to engage a Health Effects Advisory Committee to make sure that we have the most recent information. And we try to bring the technical together with the policy there. So this will be an ongoing discussion as we learn more about PFAS, and that's why we built in the review period into our regulations.
Thank you. Any other questions, Mario or Commissioner? You feel free to put me on the hot seat if you want, because I'm always putting you on the hot seat if you wanted to ask me a question about my reporting.
I do have a question for the commissioner. As you're discovering more elevated PFAS levels in different water systems, what is DEP doing to identify responsible parties? And are there any trends or patterns that you're seeing that you can speak to now?
Really glad you mentioned that, because yeah, that's one of the things that we can do to be of assistance. And it really is, it's important. We have in a number of communities where we've seen elevated levels that we go and look to see what's around there, what could be contributing to that. And so our drinking water program works with our waste site cleanup program, and we'll do something called site discovery. And it will help identify the sources, which are good not only to abate the problem, but also, in the field of contribution, to help address cleanups, to have other people, help pay, for the cost of addressing this, and also just generally improve our knowledge and understanding of what's going on. So we're active working in those with those communities. We also have a private well program, because while the drinking water standards geared towards public water systems, not everybody in the Commonwealth is on a public water system. So we're in a number of communities right now, working with the boards of health to do sampling of private wells to see, first of all, make sure we know what's going on in those communities, and also help contribute to that knowledge base. So it is a very important part of the program that once we know that we are dealing with a community that has a problem, that we're trying to identify what the source of the problem is, so we can identify all the remedial actions with them going forward.
Thank you, everybody. And this conversation could go on for hours, and it is, while dense, incredibly important and interesting. Each of you have brought an incredibly valuable perspective. And from my point of view as a reporter, I can't tell you how much I benefit from all of your wisdom, and thank you so much for being willing to talk to the Globe repeatedly about these issues. Obviously, there's a lot of interest, and there's so much to learn. I think we're out of time, so I'm going to wrap it up and pass it back to Mary. Thanks again, and there'll be a final word from our sponsor. So thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, David, and to our panel for that wonderful discussion. I'd love to hand it back to Ben now to close us out.
Thank you, Mary. What an impressive group of experts, and what a great discussion. I agree, could have gone on for hours. But now the cleanup begins, and fortunately the problem is solvable. Several processes for removing PFAS currently exist. However, these can work well in certain situations. They tend to be extremely expensive, especially when dealing with high concentrations of PFAS. But innovation is coming to the rescue, and more technology developers are actively finding solutions to deal with these persistent chemicals. It's not our first tango, and solutions are coming to light every day. And at Senexen, we believe it's our mission and our calling to deal with the PFAS problem swiftly, vigorously, and widely. And we are ready to do so, not only because we've proved it can be done, but also because our company has a strong 35-year history of taking on difficult contamination problems and solving them very efficiently. It's with those achievements in mind that I feel confident that we can deal with the PFAS crisis. Our innovative ultra-proven solutions also allow us to remove PFAS from our environment and destroy them safely and affordably. At Senexen, we pride ourselves on the ability to get in, get the job done quickly, no matter what, and get out, leaving you to concentrate on your daily activities PFAS-free. So with that in mind, thank you very much, and I bring it back to you, Mary.